I have to apologize a little bit because I had some computer issues on short notice, preparing the slides on short notice. So I had some crashes, so I couldn't even test the whole talk. So if there are any hiccups or anything not as it looks up, I already apologize in advance. So as Mohsen mentioned, he asked me actually to change a little bit the topics or extend a little bit of topics to cover these parts in a kind of introductory fashion of maybe what Carolina was meant to talk about. And therefore, my talk will be maybe slightly different to what you saw in the overview. So I had to maybe cut some other parts, but I hope nevertheless it will be still engaging and inspiring and maybe a good starting point to read up more on certain of the concepts or on the corresponding research. So I will start with a kind of brief introduction on complexity or complexity science and talk about core concepts or terms that people use that are sometimes maybe a bit more refined and defined, sometimes a bit vague, but what people usually mean by this, in particular about the concept of emergence and what it means. Then I will introduce agent-based models or agent-based modeling as a tool to study complex systems and give some examples. And in particular, we will move on then to modeling flocking and collective decision-making as an example of self-organized collective behavior. So as an example where we can actually study emergent features and emergent phenomena from microscopic rules from simple interactions. Overall, let's see whether I really can talk about everything because I have quite a lot of material, and just to stay within time limits, I might need to cut some things, and maybe we can then pick them up in a discussion if there's interest in them. And in general, this will be more of a broader overview talk to cover some ground, to really go from very general concepts what is complexity to some actually current, very recent research that we're doing in the field of decision making and self-organized collective behavior. So let's get started with the introduction part. So first of all, when we're talking about complex systems, what is a complex system? And I learned, or I heard that actually Mohsen gave to you the More is Different article by Anderson, a giant in the field, who already in the 70s, wrote this quite short article, which really is kind of defining moment for a lot of complexity science. And one should also see this, in the context where this article was written was in the 70s. It was a very different world. And a lot of the things that we maybe nowadays take as granted in science and research and understand, Anderson was maybe the first one to spell them out. In particular, this idea that, if you put a lot of even simple units together and they start to interact, what you will have at the macroscopic scale is something that you cannot really understand from looking at individual units. And this was definitely something that, or not easy to understand from looking at individual units. It was something that was actually, and maybe still is to some of more kind of traditional physicists, and Anderson was a physicist, kind of a, let's say, hard thought to process. Because a lot of physics, and I'm a physicist by training, is actually built on the concept of reductionism, so that you can, go to the smallest building blocks, and when you understand those, you can build up bottom up the whole world, so to say. And initially, one was thinking, okay, I just need to study hard enough the individual units, and I will have an understanding of, for example, what a solid is when I put a lot of molecules together, or other more complicated matters. However, this is, as Anderson put it there in this article, which I very much recommend if you haven't read it to read it, is that, in complex system, they will exhibit some sort of behavior on a macroscopic scale, which is either cannot be predicted, or at least is very hard to predict from the individual parts and also their interactions. And this is what is typically referred as emergence or emergent phenomena. And these emergence properties, because of this very definition, are also hard to engineer. So if you would like to compose now a complex system together and engineer it, this is actually something that is really hard or almost impossible to do. And on the contrary, actually emergent phenomena are oftentimes the things that break the things that you would like to engineer on a collective system. And in engineering, there's something called for example, course of dimensionality, which is known basically if you're trying to assemble, larger and larger system or more components. At some point, it's really hard to control them and make them robust and do them what they want to do. And this is because of emergent properties. You can put it in a different way. Is that if you think of emergence and the kind of macroscopic behavior is more than the sum of its part, whatever this means. But this is like another thing to colloquially just express the same idea. And these are some examples from physics and biology and what you could think of. So for example, you can think of fluid, which is actually a composition of many molecules, which we actually know the physics quite well. But then, depending on the situation you can have rather, let's say, simple behavior, which is flow, which still emerges from pressure differences and the dynamics of these fluid molecules. But you can have also very complex emergent behaviors like turbulence, which is still not fully understood to this day, and still an active field of research. And there's nothing in the property of individual fluid molecules that tells you that there should be something like turbulence. If you think of water molecule or something else, there's just nothing. This is really truly a macroscopic phenomenon that you can only observe and only emerges at sufficiently large macroscopic scales. And the same can be said for many condensed matter systems. So you can think of, again, molecules, atoms coming together, forming lattices potentially, or more disordered media. But then you have macroscopic properties at the level of the whole object that is formed of these molecules, that something like solidity or elasticity, conductivity, like how electric currents are transported, or even like sound, which is actually a consequence of elasticity. So these are, again, concepts that are macroscopic and they cannot be traced to the individual atoms in your solid. And if you think of ecosystems, ecosystem would be an interaction of many species, many individuals within the species, but also many different species. You might have something like food webs emerging there naturally. This would be another emergent phenomenon or emergent structure. But evolution as a process also is something which emerges in this type of natural systems through interaction of individual agents, animals, organisms for resources, as well as the kind of competition for these resources. We can actually make it a bit more visual. You can think of snowflakes, a classic example of emergence. So where we have an inanimate matter, so there are non-living, so to say, units, basically water molecules coming together. And again, there's nothing in the water molecule or in the properties of the water molecule. You can study it with great detail, and actually a water molecule, a hydrogen molecule, even, this is the only one that we can fully understand analytically, but water molecule, we have fairly good understanding. So you can study this to great detail in physics, but you won't be able to predict what are actually the shapes of the different snowflakes that are generated. And they're very variable. In our current state of knowledge, this is actually a complex interplay of multiple factors, properties of the molecules, of course, but also something like humidity and temperature, environmental factors that actually contribute to the differences in these patterns here. But we can go to the living world, and this is now just an image of a single cell. And you can see is that there are plenty of stuff inside. So this is the different organelles which are all responsible for a functioning of a cell. And you can imagine it's not like, it's a static snapshot, but there's permanently something moving, interacting, and there's a lot of dynamics going on there. And these cells perform a function. This is now like a kind of idealization. This is only the signaling network of a cell. So essentially our current state of knowledge, like how the different molecular players that you might have such in the cell, like proteins, other molecules, how they interact together with things like channels on a membrane to actually allow the cell to detect something like a signal, a chemical signal from the outside, and react to it in some sort of a function. So this is already a strong abstraction, but you can see already there are multiple components that are interacting. So these type of things will generate behavior, and life in itself can be viewed as emergent behavior, which is really hard, if not impossible, to predict from the full knowledge, for example, of the physics of individual organelles, of individual proteins, of individual molecules within the cell. But we can go even further. You can think of multiple levels of organization. If you think of living systems, so we are talking just about one cell, but then you can assemble cell into tissues, tissues form organs, and then organs are in self-interacting in organ systems up to forming a whole organism, a whole body. And at each level of organization, you again will get new emergent phenomena, which are sometimes very important because, for example, liver or stomach, they have actually a function, and they have emergent properties, which evolve through natural evolution, through Darwinian evolution, to allow organisms to survive and be actually successful in their environment. So this is, going from single cells to whole organism, but we can also think of multiple organisms. And this is an example now of ants performing collective movement, and this is so-called spiral of death. Why is it called like that? Well, this is actually pathological behavior, which was observed, I think, the first time in the 30s. But basically what the ants do, they lay a pheromone, a trail pheromone, which others will like to follow. And just by chance, in this particular situation, they were laying a pheromone and which curved, and then basically they started following each other. And every ant lays a pheromone, so it's kind of self-reinforcing system, and you get the spiral of death, or the mill of death happening. So this is an emergent phenomenon. There's nothing in the trail formation of individual ants and how individual ants follow this that would predict this, but this just happens from certain initial conditions and certain interactions that eventually becomes like an emergent state of this ant system, and it's also rather stable. It can be that stable that actually ants run forever in such a circle until they starve, essentially, they die. So this has been observed before. But of course, emergent phenomena don't have to be pathological. If we think again of the same ant system, they can, like army ants, can also form bridges over gaps, which might be very helpful for the population to, of course, be able to cross in the jungle, something like gaps in leaves between different trees and so on. And how do they do this? They do this by a very simple mechanism where they basically attach to others, and then if they realize there's a gap, and then they basically follow, they don't even realize there's a gap, to be honest. They just follow simple rules, and eventually they build like a bridge out of their bodies where other ants can follow on them. So ants is a beautiful example of self-organization, emergent phenomena that has been studied widely and is being still studied. But ants are, I should mention, are biologically so special because they're closely related. So it's so-called eusocial insects. So evolutionary, they are very essentially almost like a superorganism, like one organism, because they're so closely related. But we see, of course, examples of emergence also in systems of non-related individuals. And you can think now of a school of fish, and these are prey fish, and they're hunted by predators. And here you see beautiful examples of coordination. I might play it again, where you see, on the one hand, coordination within the school of fish. So this is called schooling or flocking, but also there's this interaction with predators. So you also have emergent phenomena, not only from within one system, but actually of competing species, if you think now of a larger system. And then finally, we can go to even more complex systems, more from the realm of social science. You can think of cities as complex systems. And there's nothing in the bricks that constitute building or in the minds of individual people inhabiting a city that would predict necessarily the structure of a city and the function of a city. And you can actually, however, study cities as complex systems, and it's also a very, very interesting field of research where the concepts from coming origin from physics and network science are actually being used to understand, for example, how cities grow. And you can move even a scale up, and you can look at networks of cities, how they itself can be seen as a complex system. And this is also being done if you think of kind of urban growth and urban interconnections. Okay, so now we're talking about complex system, an example of complex systems. But what does it mean complex? Well, first of all, we should maybe distinguish complex from non-complex, or distinguish it from something which is complicated, but not necessarily complex. And the classic examples of complicated systems is something like a watch or a plane. So they are very complicated. They have, more, I guess, thousands, millions of parts, maybe sometimes even, that need to be assembled in the right way for a watch or a plane to function. But these are engineered systems, and they're engineered, they're built in a way to perform a certain function. So there's nothing really emergent because, you know, there was an extremely clever engineer at some point that designed a plane or designed a watch and built it with the purpose of measuring time or flying. So in a sense, there is a function, and you could call it emergent, but it was actually known from the start, and this is where it went to. So it's, and this is actually not what is usually meant by complex systems. So this system would be typically referred to as complicated systems, maybe even extremely complicated systems, but system where we at least have a full knowledge what each part does and how it does it, because we need to rely on them functioning properly and being robust. If we don't know what a part in a plane does, that's not good. Okay. This is kind of different to if you think of, for example, flock of birds. So they might not be as complicated as a plane because you have just individuals of the same type, so kind of homogeneous. They might actually follow very simple rules, but what you observe on a macro scale, like coordinated movement, is again nothing that was necessarily predicted from the individual rules, or nothing that was engineered to be there. That actually evolved through natural evolution because it gave some advantages to the birds in the flock, like, for example, being able to use information of others to respond faster to a predator. So if there's a predator around, maybe some of your neighbors respond, and you then can watch this response, this social information, and be a bit quicker to respond to a predator, even if an individual bird has not detected them yet. So in a sense, complex does not necessarily mean complicated, but complex really refers now again to this concept of emergence and self-organization, another term that I will discuss briefly. So complex system or complex dynamics does not necessarily also mean that it has to have many degrees of freedom or many units. So one classical example is this double pendulum, where you have actually, you know, few degrees of freedom, few joints, few masses that move around. The actual dynamics is deterministic, so you can write Newtonian equations of motion. There's no stochasticity or fluctuations in there, but yet if you initialize a system and you run it and you have slight deviations, you will see very different temporal evolution. So it's really hard to predict now the kind of emergent dynamical phenomena of this rather simple system because of the underlying chaotic dynamics, which makes the system unpredictable. When we're talking about, in general, complex systems or interaction in complex systems, there's one term we should not omit, which is feedback, and more generally, feedback as a form of adaptation. And feedback is something which, of course, well known in engineering. There's a whole field of engineering, like control theory, which deals with feedback control, for example. And there, of course, feedback can be good. It can be, you know, important for self-regulation. So if you have negative feedback, you might, you know, make sure that the system operates in a special regime and make sure that the cell does not die because it accumulates too many of toxic chemical agents, or moves away from a kind of toxic environment through a feedback control of its movement. It can be positive, which can lead then to something like exponential growth or instabilities, but it's always one feature or often a core feature of complex systems. So feedback can have actually two ways. So here on the slide, I have it written that it can make chaotic systems unpredictable. Actually, it can also do the opposite. You can actually stabilize chaotic systems by feedback control. So in engineering, it's well established, and there are, you know, various aspects that you might be interested when implementing, studying, designing feedback in your systems. It could be for controllability, for self-stabilization, robustness, but also adaptability. So if you want to be really adapting to environmental change, and a classic example, one of the simplest feedback controllers is a thermostat in your heating. Depending whether it's cold outside or warm outside, you want heating to adapt and not heat all the time or heat never. And this is, of course, something that you are probably very familiar with. But feedback can also lead to unexpected dynamics in complex systems. And this is an example of a Lotka-Volterra predator-prey dynamics. It's basically agents or like populations on a lattice, and you have prey and predator, and they can evolve. And the prey should be the greenish, and the red are the predators. And they consume. So the predators consume the prey, and then the prey dies, but then there's less food, so the predator dies. And just because of this simple coupling between the predator-prey system, you might get locally oscillations. It can be very prominent, and overall, if you have a spatial extended system, you get this kind of complicated spatial-temporal pattern evolving. That again is not something you can understand or predict from the simple interactions in the Lotka-Volterra model between the prey and the predators. When we are talking about complex systems, emergence, one term that often comes up is synchronization. And synchronization, there are various aspects of it, but usually what synchronization means is basically phase matching of different oscillators. And you can think now of a blinking firefly as an oscillator. So it fires, then has a cycle, and fires again, cycle, and so on. And what is hard to see, unfortunately, here is that initially these fireflies actually are desynchronized, so they all blink randomly. But what they do, actually, they watch others, they get the visual input of others blinking, and through this interaction, they're actually able to synchronize their phases. And suddenly, if you watch this over a longer time period, you see that actually a whole tree or whole bushes, somewhere where you have a lot of fireflies, start to fire and blink in synchrony. So this is a classical example of synchronization, which, to be honest, I actually don't even know whether this has any biological function. It could be just a byproduct of the fireflies generating this blinking signal to attract mating partners, and at the same time having some sort of visual coupling. In the same way, and another classical example of synchronization are clocks that are actually coupled mechanically, like these old clocks with a pendulum, and they can actually start to synchronize as well, simply through very weak interactions, for example, just being attached to the same wall. They don't even have to be explicitly connected. They can be attached to the same wall, and because of slight vibrational couplings, they can actually synchronize. And fireflies is a different mechanism, which is non-mechanistic, non-mechanic, but through visual interactions. One interesting example of the synchronization, which is kind of pathological, is actually the Millennium Bridge. And I apologize for this movie. Somehow it's not explained correctly, but there was a pedestrian bridge open somewhere in the 2000s in London. And it was actually engineered for pedestrians. And of course, if you're engineered, you want it to be stable. But once they opened the bridge, everything looked fine. They opened the bridge, and there were like hundreds of thousands of people walking across this bridge. And suddenly what one could start seeing is a wobbly behavior. So the whole bridge started to oscillate. And it was unpredicted. This was an example of an emergent phenomenon, and in this case of an undesired emergent phenomenon in an engineering system. And what were the reasons for this? And here again, complex systems and kind of interdisciplinary collaborations contributed to understanding of this nonlinear phenomenon. And there were basically two factors contributing to them. One is strong winds that actually excited the bridge. The second one was actually the high density of humans walking on the bridge. And if you walk on a bridge, we have two legs, so we walk like this, and we immediately move a little bit to the left to the right. And if everyone does it disorderly, then the overall force on the bridge would just vanish, and then nothing would happen. But through this mechanical coupling that we are, all these humans were walking on the same bridge, there was actually a slight feedback from the bridge, which made people to synchronize their steps without even noticing that, just slightly. So that they were not now walking independently. So their steps were not kind of randomly placed, but they were like doing the steps in synchrony, which then amplified the force generated by the feet, by the humans on the bridge, which actually eventually contributed to this macroscopic phenomenon emerging. So very beautiful example of the bridge. After a few days of synchronization, after a few days, it had to be closed because there was a danger that it would actually collapse. It was not meant to wobble all the time like this. And what was the solution? Well, the solution was to put additional weights on the bridge to change its own frequency, like the eigenfrequency of the bridge, so that it actually was very different to the frequency of stepping for humans. Therefore, humans could not excite the oscillations of the bridge through the walking. And the feedback was kind of destroyed. Another term when thinking about or talking about complex system, or which often appears when people talk about complex system, is self-organization. And you can think now of self-organization both in space and in time, or only in space or only in time. And typically, self-organization is actually used analogously to the term emergence. So they can be interchangeably used. However, what I like about self-organization actually that it puts much stronger emphasis on this bottom-up emergence of macroscopic phenomena or macroscopic properties, and also from rather implicitly also from rather simple rules. So it's a kind of self-organization, and means that simple rules how units interact may lead to emergent phenomena or self-organized patterns. And classical examples, very famous examples, are so-called Turing patterns in morphogenesis or chemical reactions, which basically is responsible for the patterning of animals. And one can understand these patterns, how they emerge, simply from interaction of two chemical agents, so-called activator and inhibitor, that affect each other in different ways. So one is activating the other, but the other is inhibiting the first one. And what you also need as an additional ingredient is different diffusion coefficients of these two. So they have different diffusive ranges. And once you put this together and let the system run, you always will get this Turing pattern. And this is very well understood how this pattern formation emerges. So that would be an example of spatial self-organization, because you get these patterns in space which eventually become static. But you can also have like temporal self-organization. So the example of synchronization was an example of temporal self-organization, and they could have both together if you think of flocking or moving of animals together. Okay, so this was about self-organization, and now very briefly to the term emergence itself. Because if you look in the literature, some academics, but mostly philosophers, actually differentiate different types of emergence. On the one hand, weak emergence, and on the other hand, strong emergence. This sounds a little bit like diminutive, like negative, but it basically means that your macroscale properties or phenomena are, on the one hand, emerge bottom-up from the complex interplay of individual components and through their interactions. And if you would have the right model on the microscale, you can actually put them in a computer and simulate, and you should observe the emergent phenomenon there as well. It does not mean that it's always possible, because you might not have the right model. It might be also too complicated, too computation intensive to simulate, for example, a whole organism or whole brain, although some people attempt to do that. But it's principle possible. So it's principle, you can identify truths, as philosophers say, about the macroscale phenomena from the truths or the understanding of the microscale phenomena. Strong emergence, on the contrary, was proposed, and as I said, mostly by philosophers already like in the first half of the 20th century. And that claims that the macroscopic properties of a complex system showing emergent phenomena are actually of an entirely different quality, or new quality, which cannot be really traced back or understood from the individual level or microscopic level components. So how Chalmers put it in his article, where he distinguishes them, is so the truths about the high-level phenomena are not deducible even in principle from the truths in low-level domain. So this is a little bit of philosophy speak, but in the end, what it means is there's no chance we will be ever able to simulate emergent phenomena, even if we would have the right model and the infinite computation resources. So there's no way to do that. And for me, as a natural scientist, this sounds very esoteric. So I don't know any example of a natural or biological or any system in the universe where I would imagine that there's something coming out of nothing, like kind of emergent property. So for me, it sounds a little bit like some form of deism or dualism. So that means there's some kind of supernatural entity emerging from nothing, completely independent of the real world, or dualism, that the mind is really separated from the brain and can exist in some kind of independent spheres. For me, this sounds like esoterics. Therefore, I would, my personal opinion, even if philosophically, it's possible to define such thing and kind of it's thinkable. But as a natural scientist, I would talk of emergence. And what I would mean by that is weak emergence. So that there's always, at least in principle, the way that we can understand emergent phenomena from the lower scale or the lowest scale of dynamics. When we think of complex systems, there's another important ingredient oftentimes, which is that there is some influence or some role of stochastic dynamics, which on top of all the things that I said, makes them also hard to predict what will be the emergent phenomena on the large scales, because we cannot really control the stochasticity. But it might affect, the dynamics at all scales, including the largest one, the macroscopic one. And what are potential sources of stochasticity in essentially any system? Well, there are three main ones, which I put in here. First one is chaotic dynamics. Then quantum mechanics, which is actually, our current understanding of the microscopic world. So at the lowest length scale is governed by quantum mechanics, and this is by itself is a probabilistic theory. So there's no escaping stochasticity, at least in terms of physics. And last one, which is probably the most prominent one, which plays most important role for complex systems, I would say, is some sort of fluctuations or noise emerging from the environment potentially, or from some internal processes that we can resolve when modeling our complex system. And I will try to make it more explicit what I mean by this. So first of all, what about stochasticity from chaotic and nonlinear dynamics? Well, one of the classic examples which you often use probably yourself for stochasticity is throwing a dice or throwing a coin, right? Because we believe that this is random and that the coin may have a heads or tails up with 50% chance if it's a fair coin. A perfect dice has one of the numbers with 6 sides appearing with probability 1/6 if it's a fair dice. However, in general, such a tossing a coin or rolling dice could be described by a set of differential equations, or even like rigid body equation, where you have your dynamical variables, a differential equation, and on the right hand side you have some kind of a function which depends again on your state variables. And so this is an example of a deterministic system, and exactly for the same initial conditions, we know from the theory of ordinary differential equations, you should get exactly identical results every time you throw a dice or you throw a coin. Well, this is not what we observe when we do this. And here stochasticity emerges from the uncertainty of initial conditions. So we never, if you throw a dice or a coin, you never are able, even if you would try to reproduce exactly the same initial conditions. And together with the nonlinearity, which typically is hidden in this right-hand side of the differential equation, this leads to so-called chaotic behavior or divergent behavior, is that even arbitrarily small deviations in initial conditions will exponentially diverge in trajectory space, and therefore, which we cannot really predict what happens in long term. And long term means already like a few milliseconds basically to the future. And then every time you would repeat it, your coin flip would look different, and what you in particular cannot predict is which side it will follow. Another classic example of stochasticity emerging from or chaotic dynamics is the so-called logistic map. So it's a kind of simple discrete system was initially proposed as a discrete system for growth. So we have this something like an exponential growth term minus a quadratic kind of death term, which should stabilize the system at some finite population size. However, this is a discrete system in time, so we take this in discrete time. So you have time n+1, and then here you have time n, and then you iterate. And basically, your population can be between 0 and 1. So this is something like a concentration of your, for example, of your population. But now if you run this system for the value of lambda of this growth parameter here for 4.0, after 500 iteration, if you have this initial condition just differentiating by, 1 to the power minus 6 or 7, you get very different outcomes. Basically, your outcome is not linked at all anymore to your initial condition. So the initial conditions are very close in, so to say, your space, but the outcomes after 500 iterations are not. And this is a classic example of chaotic dynamics. And this is now a kind of bifurcation diagram. I apologize for the blurry labels here. So this would be lambda parameter, that would be your xt, let's say, over multiple observations. And if you have small lambda, you actually get like a very predictable dynamics. But once you get to a certain lambda, there's something called like a bifurcation. So you get a splitting up, and you might already be either here or here, which is kind of unpredictable. Will depend on your initial conditions, but still rather predictable. Let's put it like this. But the further you down to move to larger and larger lambdas, you see more and more such a bifurcation. And eventually for lambda 4, and this is what the simulations were run for here, you basically cannot predict which values of x of t you will have after some steps. If you cannot control your initial conditions really up to infinitely many digits. In the computer, we cannot do that. In the computer, we have how many? 50 digits, 16 digits that we can control it. And that's already sufficient for you to, if you would just wait long enough to get completely different results. And it has nothing to do with precision of integration, because it's a discrete equation. It should be absolutely exact. So it's not about solution of your differential equation. It's really about chaotic dynamics. Okay. What about stochasticity for quantum mechanics? So there's one classic example where you can think, which you probably know from high school physics, is radioactive decay. So if you take a large population of atoms, then you get a nice exponential curve corresponding to the decay of your radioactive elements. But if you have a small sample, let's say only 50 or even only one down here, then your decay becomes stochastic. So in particular here for low numbers, you can see sometimes this plateau is appearing, where for a long time, no atom or no radioactive decay takes place. But then it takes place in something like multiple atoms decay at once, and then a small plateau and so on. And here, for example, especially if you look at very low numbers, then it becomes very, very stochastic and unpredictable. So you have an average probability that decay can happen per unit time. But it doesn't tell you anything about single realization or single atom. And this is a classic example where, just by fundamental physics, you might get stochasticity at the lowest scale in your complex systems. Just a side note, you could use this process, for example, to generate truly safe random number generators. So for cryptography, of course, this is important to have not only random numbers, or at least have them as difficult to predict as possible. And if you take some natural process like decay, then you can get actually almost safe cryptography algorithm, or basically safe procedures that cannot be hacked by just listening to the communication. Maybe just a side note, which I always find funny, which I like to talk about when I'm talking about random number generators. There's actually a firm in California that uses lava lamps for generating random numbers. I hope everyone knows what a lava lamp is. This works, that it gets heated up and does these beautiful patterns. And this is another example of emergent phenomena, this basic turbulence we observe. And what they do, they take pictures or images of this at different time points and generate random numbers based on this kind of random patterns. And then they use this as Cs, for example, for the pseudo-random number generators. Again, this is just one example where an emergent phenomenon, this turbulent phenomenon, is being used for some kind of useful function. But I always find funny that there's actually a firm that has like a whole area of lava lamps running and just taking pictures of them. But there's, of course, a need for that. What about the last part, which are fluctuations or noise, and which can come more from environmental processes? And a classic example of this is Brownian motion of a dust particle in a fluid, or in general Brownian motion. So this was, this type of data was recorded like in the times of Brown. I don't think he did it this way, but others after him did this like this. So basically you record the position of a dust particle over time, and what you realize under the microscope that it's does not stand still if it's sufficiently small, but permanently wiggles around. Okay, and therefore, where does it come from? Well, you cannot understand this by just looking at the dust particle itself, but you can understand it if you look at the water molecules impacting the dust particle. So in a sense, your noise comes now from the myriads or billions of kicks per second of individual molecules on the surface of your particle. Each is very small, but together they contribute to a kind of stochastic force which can displace and lead to microscopic diffusion and microscopic effects that we observe. So if you would model the whole system, you couldn't understand this stochasticity, but usually this is just far too complicated. And you would like maybe to look at many particles or maybe microorganisms moving around that also are subject to Brownian noise like bacteria. There, you just assume you have some kind of a noise source, which comes from other processes. Okay, so we are already at halftime, so I will have to speed up a little bit. So far there was like this general broad introduction to complex systems. But now, my topic of research is working on agent-based models. I want to present agent-based models here as a tool to study emergent phenomena, which is a very flexible tool, and in my opinion, one of the most variable and most useful, because you can basically model everything with an agent-based model. And what is the fundamental concept here? Again, I apologize for this blurry labels here. So essentially, you can think of agents having states. So this is S of I of t. And the state of individual agents can be affected by either the environment, which can also be varying over time, or by the social environment by other agents. So this would be Si, and this is Sj, so that would be the states of other agents. And then in addition, as I said, typically, if you have agent-based models, you will assume some sort of noise fluctuations affecting also the state of individual agents. And there's a whole hierarchy of agent-based models, which basically can be differentiated based on who interacts with who. One of the simplest models or simple assumptions you can make that basically every individual within your group or population or within your system has some probability to interact with any other individual, or that actually interacts with all at once. Right? So this would be something which all-to-all models or mean field models. Of course, might sound not realistic, although this might happen for some small groups, for example, of individuals. But the advantage of this is that these models are often analytically tractable. So you can do actually pen and paper calculation to understand maybe already emergent phenomena in these idealized models. The next type of models, which are actually very prominent in complex systems and complexity science, are network models or adaptive network models, where you now think of individuals or individual nodes, and there's some sort of a network governing the interaction between the individual components, which could be, for example, fish or humans doing collective movement or collective decision-making. And the last type of models what I would refer to as spatially explicit models, where this network is not either prescribed static or not following some simple dynamic, but where the network itself emerges from the movement patterns of individual agents of individual fish. So then the network itself is an emergent phenomenon from the movement rules. And these are usually the most computationally expensive models to simulate, but of course there you can have the highest level of realism if you're, for example, interested in spatial behavior of animal groups, which is my topic of research. What are examples of different types of models? So I apologize for that. My screen looks fine, not on a big screen, so I will just fix this quickly. I have a suspicion what could be a reason for that. Okay, so this is an example. Sorry for that. An example of synchronization, a model for synchronization. So essentially, these are so-called little phase oscillators. So each particle represents like a single oscillator that would like to rotate with a certain phase. But now we assume that all these phases are coupled with like a simple function. So they basically try to minimize the phase difference with some weak coupling. And what you get is eventually synchronization. And synchronization means that it's starting from random phase distribution. So essentially, like all the clocks run independent of each other initially. You end up with all of them running in synchrony, so all having the same phase. And this is now visualized by this cloud of phases moving together on your clock, so to say, here in counterclockwise, but doesn't really matter. It's just a matter of choice. And this happens even if you have heterogeneous intrinsic frequencies. So this color indicates heterogeneous frequencies. So they don't want to go all at the same pace. They actually have slightly different frequencies, but because of the coupling, they kind of still can self-organize together on a common frequency. Examples of network models are, for example, spreading of epidemics on here static networks. where we just assume that this is something like a contact network between individuals, and then we have infected individuals in red and recovered individuals, and there's a kind of persistence of some kind of a disease or epidemic spreading. It could be also some kind of other process that spreads on a network. And example of an especially explicit model would be now a model for flocking, so-called Wittig model, one of the simplest models for flocking dynamics. So here the agents just want to move and coordinate the direction of movement together with the neighbors that surrounding them in the kind of local vicinity. And just from the single rule of so-called alignment rule, you actually get emergence of order, and I will talk about this a little bit more towards the end. Okay. I will skip this. Basically, what I'm trying to say here that in general, in a kind of interface model, you want to have your agents. The state of an agent can be actually something which is a vector. It doesn't have to be a single number. It could be a vector. So, for example, in two-dimensional spaces, you could think, when you think of movement, it could be something like a position and a velocity vector. And in 2 dimensions, it would correspond to actually 4 variables defining the state of your vector. So the states can be kind of arbitrary objects that quantify the dynamics of interest. And I will skip this. And there are actually a whole now set of models that you can span, or a whole classification of models that you can span out. So you can have discrete time models that happen in discrete time, and discrete space, and this is also called rule-based models. And cellular automata is one big class of models that falls into this category. So-called voter model for social dynamics also falls into this category. Then you can have discrete time and continuous state, and this is, for example, the Wittig model that I showed just for flocking. So the continuous state space means that I have a position and a velocity or direction of movement, which is completely continuous. But the update of when a focal particle actually coordinates with others happens at discrete times. This is how the Wittig model works. But you can have also continuous time and discrete state space, and the epidemic models fall into this category. So there's a continuous time. At any point you can get infected, but you have discrete states. You're either healthy, you are infected, or maybe recovered. So your state would be a set of discrete states. And then you can have a combination of both, continuous time, continuous state, and this is typically described by stochastic differential equations. And there are all sorts of models in psychology and physics and biology, which have different names. I won't go too much into detail at this point. Again, I apologize for those labels. They look good when I looked at them just recently. But for the rules-based models, basically means that at the discrete time steps, if a condition is fulfilled, a focal agent changes the state. So you have this transitions from a state I at t-1 to some other state at time t. And for stochastic differential equation, just give you a bit of a feel. So you have actually a differential equation again, which can have 2 parts. Well, usually I assume to have 2 parts. So your state variable change continuously according to a differential equation. But the first part is usually the deterministic part, as you would have an ordinary differential equation. But in this kind of complex system models or agent-based models, you typically also have a stochastic part, which actually contains some sort of a noise or fluctuations part, which can, how strong this noise can also depend on the state variables. And this together then defines a stochastic differential equation. Okay. One example of a rules-based model is the so-called adaptive voter model. So it's one of the simplest models for opinion dynamics. What does this mean? So here we have multiple opinion, which are shown by colors. And then the focal agents, or the individual nodes are agents, they can decide when they're connected to another agent of different opinion, do I actually adapt the opinion of the other one? Or do I rewire to someone else because I don't like this opinion, because it's different from mine? And this is a classic example of an adaptive network, because the network evolves in the same process on the same time scale as the dynamics, which is the opinion dynamics. And for this adaptive voter model with this multiple opinions, what you eventually see, what will be the finite state that the system converges to, is actually multiple disconnected clusters. Because this is where you don't have any active links anymore. There's no one connected to someone else who has a different opinion, and therefore everyone is happy. And this, of course, can be also used, this type of models, to predict something like social phenomena. So, for example, polarization, classical example in a political landscape. We just had the US election happening a few days that for many actually was considered an upset. But a lot of people think that there's a really underlying issue with strong political polarizations, where basically you have two disconnected groups of people, and you can use this type of models to actually understand this type of dynamics. So, and this can already emerge from very simple rules. Just rewire if you don't like the opinion of others. Example of a stochastic differential equation model. This is something that I work on, which is this flocking models. This is now an example where we have also predator attacking them. But basically, we solve stochastic differential equations for the movement of individual fish, for example, and they have some interactions, and then they can form these beautiful flocking patterns. How much time do I have? 2 minutes.
20 minutes.
20 minutes. Oh my goodness, you scared me. So 20 minutes. Okay, I think I will try to still cover the different examples, but I hope to be fairly quick. One example for agent-based models, I already briefly mentioned, is epidemic dynamics. We can look a little bit more in detail into this. So here, classical type of models that a lot of epidemiologists use are so-called compartment models or compartmental models, or SIR models. So basically, you can subdivide the individuals into three classes: susceptible, infected, recovered. And the idea is that if a susceptible individual is in contact with some infected individuals, they have some probability of infecting this susceptible individual. Then it makes a state transition from S to I, and after some time, it may actually recover or actually go back to the susceptible state. So there are different versions of this model. And this model has been or is being intensively studied. Again, like classic examples, you can first look at well-mixed population. This is more like a textbook example. You can find now in textbook discussions of this type of model, because it allows you actually to write stochastic differential equations, deterministic differential equations for the average populations of susceptible, infected, recovered. And you can actually get analytical predictions. At what point do you see actually an exponential growth of infected? What is the epidemic threshold? What gets a little bit hard, it gets a little bit harder if you put it on networks, but this, of course, becomes more realistic. So now, instead of a well-mixed population where in principle every infected can infect some other susceptible, here you have contact networks which determine who interacts with whom, and therefore what are the potential possible infection paths. And here you can also do a lot of things, but then once you move maybe a bit further to something like temporal networks, or networks that evolve in time, or actually adaptive networks, then of course it gets harder and harder to do anything on pen and paper. You need computer simulations, agent-based simulation, but still you are able to fully understand or generate emergent phenomena that we might also observe in real-world systems. This is one example of an epidemic model, as simple as I model. So we have just two states and basically simple transition between them, like a Markov model on a network, where we see kind of a persistence of a epidemic. And this one is close to the so-called epidemic threshold, which is, again, this persistence of epidemic is an emergent phenomenon. If you are below a certain threshold, there's actually, your epidemic will almost sure die out in finite time. But once you make the infection a little bit more infectious, then at some point you get to a state where it kind of can persist, and here it encompasses let's say 50% of the system. But if you tune it up, it can actually also encompass almost 100% of the system. But this threshold, when you see this emergent of infection actually surviving, again, this is emergent property of this type of models. It can get, as I said, a bit more complicated if you look at adaptive networks. So here, what the idea is that the susceptible individuals, when they are in contact with someone who's infected, they actually cut the contact, in a sense, to protect themselves. All right, so it's kind of like isolation from infected individuals. And in this, you can actually understand better how, for example, although you are above epidemic threshold, the epidemic can still die out because the contact network is being basically fragmented. Okay, now we are coming more to an example from my own research, which is collective decision-making, which I will show some actually very recent results, even just to highlight some core concepts. So what is collective decision making about? So you can think of a group of animals or humans or agents that need to decide between multiple options. And the simplest case is that you have two options. So a real world example would be a school of fish or a group of fish that want to decide which way to go. Either maybe they want to go for food somewhere here, or they could also go there. But there is actually some uncertainty about this option. So there are, for example, there's a vegetation, there might be a predator behind that. And maybe some of the agents detected the predator and they know, okay, this would be the correct way to go. Whereas others, they didn't detect it and they want to go to the food and they have the initial preference to go actually to this direction. And now you can ask, how are such collective system able to maybe make good decisions so that everyone goes in the correct direction and there's a consensus to survive? And there's a very active field of research when we are talking about something like wisdom of crowds. Under what conditions do collectives make better decisions than individuals? And again, I cannot go too much into details here, but there's a wide range of collective decision-making models. And they can range from something which, again, falls into this category of this all-to-all or mean feed models. And these are typically majority or quorum rules, where an individual in a group just decides whether a certain fraction of agents decided for option A, then it decides also for option A. That would be like a threshold model. But it requires that I can calculate the threshold of the whole group. So it requires that I have actually interaction with everyone. Or I can look at networks of interactions. And this is, for example, something we've been looking at, where I can only interact with few neighbors that I'm connected to, and the opinion dynamics needs to propagate on this network. And there's some biological examples from this, like, for example, the nest choice in bee colony is a classic example where bees try to find out what is the good nest to move to, and they might have multiple locations, and they're trying to find the best of K options. And they're very good at that. And they're very good at that, although no individual bee has full information. It's kind of a fully distributed algorithm, but actually inspired also algorithms for artificial agents for computer applications, engineering applications. Oftentimes, the decision-making literature or collective decision-making literature focuses on binary decisions because they're the simplest ones, so two options. But in principle, you can extend it to multiple options. Again, as I said, the general big question is, under what conditions are groups wise? But maybe there are also conditions where groups are actually stupid and actually worse than individuals making decisions. And these are essentially two sides of a coin. And by understanding or by simulating the systems and modeling them with agent-based model, we can actually understand the conditions for this emergent phenomena of wise crowd or stupid crowd. One, for example, model that we looked at, more of a state-of-the-art outlook. So there's actually a model proposed by Hart et al. On agents trying to make a decision, but also not being kind of completely neutral, but having sometimes preference for either one or the other opinion. And this is now indicated by this color of the agent. So we have neutral agents, but then we have agents that have preference for the blue opinion and agents that have preference for the red opinion. And then they have, of course, the opinion they currently have. So a blue agent, although this agent has a preference for blue option, can have opinion red, but it's of course much more likely to switch to blue if there's the possibility, and you can have a vice versa. So there are basically just two options that you can also describe or implement by +1, -1. That would be opinion up, opinion down. And we have another continuous variable, omega, which describes how biased they are towards one or the other opinion. And what is interesting is this model was initially proposed by Hart et al. In a physics journal because it can be actually mapped to so-called spin models, which is a class of systems studied in statistical physics, where you just can think of spins of little magnets, for example, that actually interact on lattices. And then you can ask the question about emergent phenomena like magnetization, like do all the spins flip in the same direction? And this would correspond in a decision-making process to a consensus decision. If all agents would have the same opinion, then the system would be in consensus. So there's this intrinsic relation between opinion dynamics and some physical systems like spin systems, and therefore this type of spin models have been used by different people to model decision dynamics. Again, I don't want to go to details, but this is basically a type of theoretical predictions that you can get. So this is now the mean opinion of the if it would be 1 or -1, and everyone would have the opinion for option 1. if it's -1, everyone would have the opinion for -1. But we can have also values in between, because a certain fraction, not everyone is of the same opinion, and therefore if you average over all opinions, you get something between 1 and -1. And in particular, we can have also a so-called disordered state if you have a very large system, where your average opinion is 0, because basically 50% have one opinion and 50% have another opinion, so it's a kind of undecided state. And what these different curves that you see here was our predictions for how bias would affect the equilibrium mean opinion in the end after you run the system for a long time. And here on the x-axis, what we vary is a measure of noise or fluctuations in the system, which you can call temperature in analogy to physics. So how likely are individuals to flip their opinions, just independent of any interactions? And what you see is what you can predict is that basically for this, so the middle curve here is when there are no biased individuals, so it's all neutral individuals. And then you have this kind of nice spontaneous, so-called spontaneous symmetry breaking. So if you are in a low temperature, either all the agents go to -1 or +1, but it's random which direction they go. That's the reason why it's called spontaneous symmetry breaking. We break the symmetry plus minus, so it either goes there or there, but which one is completely random for this middle curve. If we have some bias, effective bias, so for example, the number of individuals biased in the positive direction is slightly higher, then we see one of these curves here, where the bias already kind of makes this nice sudden transition that we have here from a collective decision state to a disordered state vanish. It kind of just monotonously goes down. And this particular point here, it's something which is referred to in physics as continuous phase transition. And this point would be called so-called critical point. And this continuous phase transition only exists for a fully unbiased system without any preference, and it vanishes if we have some bias in the system. And for physicists, it's really interesting to study those transitions, these critical points, because they have some special properties. But we can have also other dynamics. So this is now just a visualization of other set of parameters where we have a very strong biased minority and a weaker majority. And a strongly biased minority is actually biased to the negative. And if we have, now I have to look, if we have fully uninformed system, then the system actually shows again this kind of spontaneous symmetry breaking. But then if we increase or decrease the number of uninformed individuals, so we end up only with biased individuals, we get suddenly this kind of discontinuous jumps in our opinion dynamics. And this is, again, a different type of a phase transition, and it's called so-called discontinuous phase transition. And they are fundamentally different in physics, therefore it's really important to distinguish those. And again, these are emergent phenomena. There's nothing that tells you that there should be such a transition from just looking at individual agents, even knowing the interaction with the neighbors. But we observe them on a macro scale only, at the level of the macroscopic magnetization. And whether it's actually jump-like change or whether it's continuous change, again, this is another emergent property. Okay, I will skip this. And what I showed so far were actually results on a kind of complete graph that I told you. So this would be corresponding to mean field systems. There are results from the previous studies on regular lattices, which is a special kind of networks. And what we're currently working on, for example, is now looking at so-called random graphs, where you can go either from this complete graph or regular lattice by different processes. And this is oftentimes a good first description of more real-world networks. Although it's still a random graph, but it's each agent has a finite number of neighbors. So we're trying now to understand how the structure of the network actually affects these things, and there are some interesting results coming out as well. For the final few minutes, and I hope I might maybe do a few minutes more, I want to talk about flocking and in particular flocking as an example of self-organized collective behavior. And what do I mean by flocking? That's coordination of movement. And here we have already bacteria showing some coordinated movement, or you can call it flocking or schooling behavior, which basically happens because of physical interaction of individual bacteria. So they want to move, they are rod-shaped, and because of physical interactions, they can actually start to coordinate the movement. But we can have also non-physical interactions leading to collective movement, and this is a beautiful example of starlings, birds flying over the sky somewhere in England. And they are able to coordinate the movement almost as a single organism. And biologists were actually stunned by this, that in the 20s of the past century, like 1920s, there were even some people seriously proposing there's no way how they can coordinate such big systems through interactions. There must be telepathy. So there was a serious proposition that telepathy is responsible for these patterns. Now we know better, because there's an example of emergent phenomenon, and we have models where we can actually generate this emergent phenomenon from very simple rules. And this is something I want to briefly talk about. So again, apologize for the screwed up equations. So essentially, we describe each agent here by a set of stochastic differential equations. So this would be a change in position vector is given by the velocity vector, and the change in the velocity vector is given by the force vectors. In the same way, you can think of Newtonian equations of motions for, from high school physics. But now this is something like these forces have actually special meaning. So there's something like individual movement force, which just describes how a single agent moves through the environment, how it might interact with the environment. Then you have social interactions, which you put in typically a second component in your differential equation. And then always you try to put some kind of randomness that accounts for the non-accounting stochastic processes that might play a role. For example, individual decision processes in the brain of a bird that are not really relevant for your function. And if you do this, there actually has been a proposal of classical models for flocking, and I would say probably 90% or even more than 90% of all models of flocking in the literature actually follow this pattern. But you have actually three social forces, and that's why I call 3A rules: avoidance, alignment, and attraction. Avoidance means if two agents are too close, just get away from them, so to avoid collisions. Alignment means if I'm kind of in a preferred distance, not too close to others, then I try to coordinate my movement direction with my neighbors in the vicinity. And this is called alignment. And finally, attraction is if I get separated too far away, I'm actually feeling something like attractive force to the group or to neighbors in order to ensure cohesion of the whole group. And if you look in the literature, the first model that already had these three ingredients was proposed by Suzuki and Sakai in 1973, so it's more than 50 years ago. And since then, there have been various variants of this model, sometimes having only one of these interactions, studied from different disciplines. And maybe a very kind of interesting example for this crowd here is the so-called Boyd's model that was proposed actually by a computer scientist, not to understand emergence or any biological behavior of groups, but to generate such graphical demos in the 80s very computationally efficiently. Because what people did before, when they wanted to have flocks, they actually programmed individual trajectories of all the agents by hand to have nicely looking graphical demos to showcase the power of the hardware. And Reynolds came up actually with this nice idea of why not just use simple rules to generate them, to have some kind of a generative trajectory model. And he came up actually with this 3-rule model, which Suzuki and Sakai actually had before, already inspired by biological swarms, but he didn't know about that. And it was actually very influential, this model, and actually also triggered some interest in the biologists to study this type of models, that they might be actually really important and really helpful to understand self-organization and emergence in animal groups in collective movement. And there were later other models like the so-called cousin model from one of our collaboration partners, which has been hugely influential in the biology kind of field, although it was essentially following very similar patterns. But it actually asked biological questions and used the model to address biological questions. And the next slide are actually broken, and therefore I will just skip them. Anyway, we're running out of time, so I was just going into details how you could implement this forces. I'm happy to discuss this more if anyone's interested. This is now the examples of this cousin model that I just mentioned. So first of all, Ian cousin moved into 3 dimensions, which is of course more realistic, although it's not much of a difference. But it was able to predict different emergent patterns that are actually also observed in fish schools in the same way, through just simple changes in some of the parameters of the social interactions. So you could have this kind of disordered but cohesive swarms, like, for example, mosquito swarm, or you could have this rotating schools or milling schools. This is something you observe in fish, in sea fish oftentimes, like in the open ocean, but you could also have this highly ordered movements. Okay, I will skip this here. But I will briefly talk about this here. So this is now a version of a minimal alignment model. It has only one interactions, no collision avoidance, no repulsion at short ranges, no attraction at long ranges, only alignment with nearby neighbors. And starting from random initial conditions with some periodic boundary conditions, so someone leaves here, this agent can enter here again, you actually can show that you get like long-range order. So in the end, if you start from random initial condition, the system self-organize that all the agents start to move approximately in the same direction. Again, this is an example of so-called spontaneous symmetry breaking of a phase transition where in this state, all the agents on average, I don't know, move maybe in this, well, there are two subgroups, one here, but eventually they will have a kind of consensus moving in the same direction. And this is the so-called Wittek model, or a simulation of the so-called Wittek model. And it's very simple. It basically looks at discrete time. The agents update their direction of movement in a sense that basically it's an instantaneous alignment in discrete time. So if an agent looks at the average direction of its neighbors, it should follow this line. So it basically flips its movement direction to this at this discrete time and just move forward with a constant speed. And there's some noise, that if you flip, you can also make some error how well you estimate this average direction. And this would be like a noise parameter, which allows you to control how well they're able to coordinate. And then it moves just with a constant speed along this direction. And everyone does it in kind of discrete time, but in moving in continuous space. And then depending on the noise, you can have very different patterns. So for example, in low noise, you not only get this order emerging, but you also get this large density fluctuations, which is another emergent phenomenon, which happens simply once you start to move with others together, you're less likely to deviate, and therefore you kind of have effective cohesion, although there's no attraction. And this emerges from this alignment rule and leads to this new emergent patterns that actually play a very important role for the physics of the systems. If you increase the noise, that this dynamics might look very different. So it's kind of more diffuse because now they try to align with the neighbors, but they make some error, like quite some error. In the end, the system is still able to coordinate, and you obtain something like average movement or flow of agents in a kind of randomly picked consensus direction, but the structures look very different. And initially, when Wittek studied this for the first time in 1995, they again saw this kind of phase transition, so-called continuous phase transition, based on noise intensity, here on the density. So either you can increase noise, then you go from high order, like all move in the same direction, to a disordered system, or you can increase the density, and you see the reverse transition if you increase density. So now what is described here, this is the average center of mass speed, or the average flow of the agents in your system. That defines your phase transition. And there was a huge, actually, revolution in physics for this type of system. So there was published in a physics journal, because there was a very closely related model, so-called XY model, which is actually modeled for magnetism in spins, where basically you had the same idea of spins that can align or have the same orientation as their neighbors, but they don't move. They're just fixed, either on a lattice or randomly distributed space. They don't move, they just try to align. And for this model, you can prove mathematically that there will be no long-range order if you make the system sufficiently large. So if you make it large enough, at some point, agents pointing in one direction will be completely uncorrelated to agents pointing somewhere far away from them. They will point in a different direction. So in a sense, you can put it differently. So if you would have just humans that are standing there trying to coordinate their gaze direction, but they're standing there not allowed to move, they would be not able to coordinate when you have like sufficiently large system. But once you start moving and you always look in the direction that you move, then they will be able to coordinate. And it's actually unimportant how big the speed is. The speed can be arbitrarily small. It just takes longer time then. And this is another, really surprising emergent phenomenon, that you can get this long-range order by adding just a tiny, seemingly tiny and unimportant component like just movement. And now, after decades of research, we can actually understand where this difference comes from. But this also leads to other, I won't fix this, other phenomena like this traveling band. So this is essentially like a system that we have here, and then there's this band of particles traveling. So it's not only that there are structures like clusters, but they actually also organize in like very large bands that are usually perpendicular to the movement direction. And these waves or these bands are other emergent phenomena. And actually, what was also more recently It was, let's say, over the last 10 years, it was found that these bands really change the whole physics of the systems. Okay, I think my computer wants me to stop. So I will be always stopping. I have just a few slides toward the end because I would like to give you an outlook of some current direction in modeling collective movement. So far, we talked about these very simple models with the 3A rules, with very simple rules, which are actually phenomenological rules. Craig Reynolds just came up with them to generate demos. Some biologists think, oh, they're biologically reasonable, so we put them in. But it's actually not how individuals interact really in biology, because usually we have vision-based interactions. So we don't have this bird-eye perspectives, knowing what are the directions of others, but we interact visually with others. And there's an ongoing, I would say, a paradigm change in modeling collective behavior, where we try to actually see how vision or how collective movement can emerge from purely vision-based interactions. And just to highlight you this change of perspective, so that will be like a bird-eye perspective, and this is only a single agent now moving in a field of static obstacles. Oops, sorry. And what you see here is that basically, there will be like, if I would have this bird-eye perspective, I could generate vectors and so on. But this is actually the visual input it gets. So there's a two-dimensional agent. It has a one-dimensional retina. It will be left eye, right eye. And these are the different obstacles, will be just black blobs on its retina, while it moves randomly through them. It doesn't even interact with them. And now imagine many of such agents trying to make sense of such an input that they are generating themselves and coordinate their movement. And that's a much harder problem than just having this bird-eye perspective where I can just draw vectors and say, oh, this is the divergent direction they move to. The cool thing about this is that we actually have data now from fish schools where we can actually reconstruct this type of visual interactions and the visual input that a single fish might get. So this is now from a tracking and then reconstructing a visual field like a shallow water tank. And what we are working on, or like our recent work, is about like changing this type of models. And now you see the correct equation from where we actually make this social force term, instead of putting phenomenological social forces like attraction, alignment, repulsion, we actually want to put eyes on the agents and really have the interaction based on the visual input. And the cool thing is that you could relate it actually to something like to get a better understanding of, for example, the physiology of eye and properties of the visual system. But we wanted to start very bottom up. So this is a paper a couple of years ago that we published together with Renaud Bastien, where we came up with a minimal vision model. And I just won't go into details. The only thing that I want to say is that essentially that would be the bird-eye perspective. So these were individual agents. And if we would have individual recognition of agents, you could show them by different colors. I know that these are two different agents, for example. But let's assume even that there is no individual recognition, no kind of distinction. So instead of this visual field where I can distinguish two different agents, I actually just see a black-white blob because these agents are overlapping in my field of view. So you can think of like a kind of a very simple animal. It could be like a developing insect or a very simple robot that just can distinguish there's something and there's nothing, like very simple sensors that you could use for this. And the question was, we wanted to ask, are we able to generate collective movement just from such an input? And again, I will skip the details because I'm running out of time. This is interesting mathematical theory that you can propose for this. And in the end, what we ended up is that you have only the interaction with the mass of your blobs and the edges in your visual field. So the only objects that an agent the only information it can use. And we don't use even any temporal dynamics or typically people look at something optical flow, whether something moves on your retina. We don't use this information. We just use the static features. How much visual mass is on the left or right-hand side of me, and how many edges do I see in my visual field. And if you do this, you can actually generate short-range repulsion and long-range attraction. And the same way in the classical 3A model, just because of the geometry of vision. And when you have this, you can actually generate all sorts of this short-range attraction, long-range repulsion. You can generate all sorts of collective patterns. So first one is actually a swarm state where you have no collective movement, but you have cohesive movement, so like mosquito swarm. And what is interesting is that there are almost no collisions. But the agents themselves, they have no concept of distance. they don't even know that there are other agents around them and that they move. They just see this swirling black-white pattern and try to respond to this through minimal visual interactions. And they're actually very good at avoiding collisions, something which is really hard for the social force models. So you have to really work hard to avoid collisions there. Here it emerges for free. But you can get more interesting patterns, like, for example, actually emergence of, in a different parameter regime, emergence of collective movements. So again, starting from random initial conditions. You see, there's actually some initial phase where they try to coordinate. This red symbol or path here is the center of mass movement. And eventually you will see all the agents start to move together and moving in unison in one direction. And if you would wait longer enough, they would see nicely like a swarm moving down here. Okay, so there's actually, again, they're coordinating the movement without knowing that they are together with others moving in a group. And they are very good at that. Can also get some kind of a milling state. Again, this is in different parameters, but essentially they spread out initially, but then they're attracted back to the kind of visual field that they perceive, and eventually they start rotating about the common center of mass. However, what you see here is that half of them are rotated in one direction, other half in the other direction, because it's just like a kind of attraction to the center of mass. This is not the typical milling pattern where they start to move all in one direction, like what we saw in the ants example. And here we believe that this is actually where something like temporal change, like optical flow, that something moves in one or the other direction, that this could lead to symmetry breaking between these two types of rotation, and that eventually we would get an emergent pattern where everyone moves in the same direction as we observe in fish. Okay, so the first insight that we get that we can actually understand how coordinated movement emerges from a much more, let's say, realistic mechanisms of interaction based through vision. But we can also harvest this now for swarm robotic systems. And this is ongoing work and a paper that we just submitted with David Meze, who is a PhD student in my group as well, where he implemented this type of visual algorithm on our Timio robots that can move in groups. And this is now the top view. This is what individual robots see. And they only respond, so even if they have individual recognition, we only use this kind of blob versus edges data. So they don't use individual recognition, although they could use it. And what we can show is that they can nicely coordinate in the same fashion as in our idealized agent-based model. And the cool thing about this is that this is completely independent of any, because it's purely vision-based, so you don't need any common communication protocol. You don't need even to have the same channels. So it can work under all conditions where you have vision. So you can coordinate the movement, you can add additional robots. It could be of different type. They are not able to communicate otherwise with other robots. And the whole flock or the whole swarm will be able to move together. And this is my summary. So I tried to cover quite a lot of ground. So I'm sorry if this was maybe a little bit too much. But starting from a kind of a discussion of core concepts in complexity science, through agent-based model as a general tool to study emergent phenomena and self-organization, I ended up by some examples, in particular on collective movement and collective decision-making, and how they help us to move just beyond general emergent pattern and emergent properties like emergent of collective common direction of movement. This is something you can get with very different models, now to actually a refined understanding of emergence of group coordination, even through more indirect channels like vision-based interactions. That's it. Thanks a lot.